It started with a bang. No, really. I mean an actual bang at midnight, echoing down the cul-de-sac like the universe was knocking on our front doors, just to remind us we were alive. If you've ever had a neighbor who seemed hell-bent on making everyone miserable, you know the type. Maybe you've got one right now, banging around in the dark, convinced they're the sheriff of some little kingdom. That night, we all heard it. Clang, clang, clang. Metal on metal, way past when any sane person would be awake, let alone outside, beating two old pots together like they were, signaling the end of days. And who was it, standing under her porch light with her hair sticking up like she'd licked an outlet? Yep, Karen. Classic. At first, you want to believe it's a joke, right? Maybe a weird prank, some TikTok dare. But this wasn't that. Karen was dead serious. That was the first shot fired in what I call the pot war. Except, no one got high, just mad. Our neighborhood had always been, well, normal. Not perfect, what is? But decent. Kids shooting hoops until bedtime. Maybe some late barbecue smoke drifting around, the distant thump of somebody's music you could only hear if your window was cracked and the crickets took a break. Life. Then Karen, self-appointed warden of tranquility, decided any sound after 9 p.m. was a personal attack. She'd stand out there waving her flashlight, shrieking about quiet hours like she was guarding Buckingham Palace. Folks tried to ignore her at first. Some even laughed, until those pots got louder. Dogs barking, babies crying, and honestly, a few grown-ups cussing quietly into their pillows. One night, her own husband, Greg, stuck his head out and tried to drag her back inside, muttering, "Karen, for God's sake, you're waking up the dead." She wouldn't budge. Me. I tried the diplomatic route, walked right up her driveway, hands out like I was negotiating with a hostage taker. "Hey, Karen, maybe we can talk this out, right? No one's disrespecting you." She spun around, eyes lit up, spit practically landing on my sneakers, and shot back. "The rules say quiet after 9. Don't like it, move out." You know that feeling, when someone's enjoying the power trip more than the rule itself. Yeah, that. She demanded silence, but made more noise than a marching band on the 4th of July. By week 3, everyone looked rough, dark circles under parents' eyes, kids cranky and tired, teenagers too scared to laugh loud in the backyard. And then Karen did the one thing no one thought she'd actually do. She called the cops on us. No joke. Said some neighbors were whispering too loud on a Friday night. The cop looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Told her laughing wasn't a crime, but Karen just stood there under the streetlight, reading him the HOA bylaws like they were the 10 Commandments. He left shaking his head. I wish I could say that. Ended it. But no, she doubled down. It became a ritual. Every night, right at midnight, clang, clang, clang. Her pots became the soundtrack of our suffering. We tried to catch her on camera, phones poking out between blinds, videos bouncing around our group chat. She was smart, though. She'd bang for just a few minutes, enough to set the babies off and the dogs barking, then disappear before anyone could catch her in the act. By the time the cops showed up, she'd be inside, all smug and quiet, like a villain who just got away with the crime. Then came the night of the Lopez birthday party. Now, if you want a mental picture, imagine a backyard lit up with cheap string lights, kids giggling, cake waiting on the table. It was about as wholesome as it gets. Around 9:45, here comes Karen, her shadow hitting the fence first, pots raised like some movie monster. "Quiet hours. Quiet hours," she screamed, banging those pots so hard you could see the sparks in her eyes. The kids ducked and screamed. Mrs. Lopez tried to stand her ground. "Karen, stop. You're scaring the children." But Karen was on a roll. She marched right into the yard, smashing metal together, screaming, while the birthday girl just stared, candles melting, tears running down her cheeks. That was it, the moment the parents snapped. Mr. Lopez, usually the quietest guy on the block, stepped up, grabbed his phone, dialed 911, and this time, half the neighborhood joined him. Everybody's phones were out, recording, voices rising. No more. Karen, sensing the crowd, just got louder, shouting, "Quiet hours or else." Her face twisted, voice cracking, hands trembling with rage. Then, here's the part nobody saw coming. Her own husband finally stepped out, looking like a ghost of himself. "Karen," he said, barely more than a whisper. "Please, You've gone too far. She spun on him, pot still in hand, screamed, You shut up too. Greg, you never support me. That's when the cops arrived. Sirens and flashing lights painted her house in blue and red. Officers stepped out with that "What the hell did we walk into" look on their faces. Karen, still swinging her pots, ran up to them, demanding they arrest all of us for disturbing her peace. The whole block stood there, filming, whispering. You could feel the tension buzzing in the air. Finally, one officer tried to take a pot. She yanked it away. Another grabbed her arm. She shrieked, high and wild, a sound that made even the dogs go silent. Then, crash, the pots clattered to the pavement, rolling to a stop. That was the end of the show. They cuffed her right there, dragged her away, still yelling she was the HOA vice president and we'd all regret it. But as the cop car pulled off, all you could hear was silence. Honest, heavy silence. For the first time in weeks, people hugged their kids. The Lopez girl managed a little smile, and Mr. Lopez stood there, phone still recording. Justice finally served. You'd think that'd be the end. But wait, twist time. Turns out, Karen hadn't just been making noise for kicks. She was trying to create a problem only she could solve, planning to use all those noise complaints as proof the neighborhood needed stricter rules, more power for her. When the HOA board saw the videos, they didn't just strip her title, they voted to boot her out entirely. She tried to fight back, letters, threats, even from jail. But nobody was listening anymore. The last sting in the tail? When she got out on bail, her husband was gone. Moved out, left her a note. You wanted silence. Now you've got it. That's the thing. Sometimes, when you fight so hard to make everyone quiet, you end up all alone. And that's the loneliest silence there is. So next time, someone bangs pots at midnight, screaming for quiet. Maybe it's not the neighborhood that's too loud. It's the noise inside them that's eating them alive. In the end, Karen didn't silence us. She silenced herself. And that's how one HOA Karen tried to run the show, but wound up getting run out, giving the neighborhood its voice back in the process. If you've ever dealt with a neighbor like that, or you've got a wild HOA story, drop a comment. Was Karen right? Or was the neighborhood justified? Smash that like button, hit subscribe, and let's hear your take on justice, community, and the wild, weird world of suburbia. Funny thing about silence, you think you want it, right up until it stretches on too long. Those first few nights after Karen was gone, the block felt almost spooky. No midnight clanging, no shouting from porches, just a heavy quiet broken only by the hum of streetlights, and maybe a couple old dogs snoring by the fence. The kind of hush where you suddenly realize how much you'd gotten used to living on edge. Kids slept deeper. The Lopezes left their backyard lights on later, just because they could. Sometimes I'd stand by the window, mug in hand, expecting to see her silhouette stalking the sidewalks like a prison guard. But nope, nothing. It felt like a spell had been lifted. Or maybe a storm had just moved on. But after a week or so, you start to notice the weird gaps she'd left behind. People tiptoed a little, still checking their watches, whispering in the driveways. Old Mrs. Delaney from across the street, who always used to bring cookies over, wouldn't step outside after dark. You could tell, folks were relieved, but there was this lingering edge, like we were all waiting for the other shoe to drop. And it did, in its own backwards way. See, with Karen gone, the HOA board actually started listening to people for once. Turns out, when you remove the tyrant, the regular folks finally find their voice. At the next meeting, Mr. Lopez stood up, not angry anymore, just steady. He talked about respect, about community, about not letting fear or control run our lives. I watched from the back, arms folded, half expecting someone to shut him down. But instead, something shifted. Folks started volunteering for stuff, organizing block parties, repainting the park benches, fixing up the little free library out by the mailbox cluster. People you never thought would agree on anything suddenly realized they all just wanted to live in peace. But, nothing in suburbia stays simple for long. About 3 weeks after Karen's mugshot made the rounds in our group chat, there was a knock at my door. I open up, and there's Greg. Yeah, her husband, looking like a guy who'd spent too many nights sleeping in his car. I almost didn't recognize him without that permanent look of defeat he used to wear. He was holding a cardboard box, hands shaking. Mind if I come in a sec? He asked. You know how awkward those moments are, but I nodded him inside. He sat at my table, just staring at the steam rising off the coffee I poured. And then he started to talk. Not about Karen, not really, but about himself. About the years he'd spent trying to keep the peace, covering for her rages, apologizing to neighbors, telling himself she'd settle down one day. I listened, let him spill. Turns out, he'd left her for good. Said the last straw wasn't even the arrest. It was that birthday party, seeing those kids cry, hearing his own daughter tell him she was scared to come home. I let it go too long, he said, voice cracking. Figured if I just stayed quiet, she'd get tired eventually. But some people only get louder when you do that. He slid the box across the table. Inside were the old HOA rulebooks, handwritten notes, a couple of Karen's evidence files. Burn them if you want. I'm done. We sat in silence a while. Then Greg looked up and asked, "Do you think people ever change?" You know, I wanted to give him some comforting line. Sure, people change, life gets better, but I just shrugged. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they just move on and leave their noise behind. Word got around about Greg's visit. After that, it was like the last bit of fear drained out of the neighborhood. People got bold. One Saturday, we dragged out grills, music, even a bouncy house for the kids. Nobody cared about the clock. Laughter bounced off the houses, and if anybody worried about breaking rules, they didn't show it. For the first time, the place felt like a real community. Messy, loud, but alive. And here's the kicker, just when you think you've seen it all. 2 months later, the HOA elections rolled around. Guess who ran for vice president? Mrs. Lopez. No surprise there. She won by a landslide. And at her first meeting, she said, "Our job isn't to control. It's to serve. To make sure everyone has a voice, even the ones we don't always agree with." Folks cheered. Someone joked about instituting no pot-banging zones, and everyone cracked up, the way people do when a shared nightmare finally becomes an inside joke. But not everyone was thrilled. There was this one guy, never caused trouble before, who stood up and said, "What if another Karen moves in? How do we keep things from getting out of hand again?" Mrs. Lopez smiled, calm as you please, and said, "This time, we won't wait for someone else to speak up. We'll do it together." It wasn't flashy, but it landed. Everyone just nodded, quietly promising to look out for each other, not let things rot in the dark. You know, there's always going to be that person, the one who tries to run the world with a rulebook and a bullhorn. But maybe the lesson is, silence doesn't keep the peace. It just lets the loudest voice win. If you ask me, I'd rather deal with the mess of living together, real, complicated, sometimes noisy, than ever go back to that kind of fearful quiet. So, yeah, that's what happened after the clanging stopped. Maybe we didn't fix everything overnight. Maybe we never will. But we're learning. And if another Karen ever shows up, I promise you, we won't let the neighborhood go quiet again. If you made it this far, let me know your wildest neighbor story down in the comments. Was the neighborhood too forgiving or not enough? Would you have handled Karen any different? Smash that like, hit subscribe, and tell me, when it comes to peace and quiet, where do you draw the line? I'll be reading every word, trust me.